Main event of the evening.
These days are
Hello and welcome to the 200th episode of These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today we are discussing Season 9, Episode 16, A Touch of Classical.
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens in A Touch of Classical.
We open with Fonzie arriving at Arnold's for a meeting of Jefferson High's concert planning committee. He immediately forgets about this as soon as he sees a pretty lady he hasn't met before.
There is a new lady in Arnold's, why wasn't I told?
He strikes up a conversation with her, during which he insults the head of the committee and the music department, before learning she's Cynthia Brannigan, the head of the committee and music department. She takes it in stride.
I promise not to hit your knuckles with a ruler.
Fonzie has $1,000 for the band that will headline the concert, and Cynthia already knows a group who she thinks would be fantastic. Fonzie gives her the money without a moment's hesitation. She's the head of the music department, so she knows what she's doing. Also because he wants to get on her good side. It works. She tells him to call her. Back at the Cunningham house, Howard, Marion, and Lori Beth are preparing to do exercises to a record.
Hi, it's time for exercising with Coach Danny. Let's start with some deep knee bends.
While Joni leaves to see Chachi, Fonzie introduces Howard and Marion to Cynthia as practically his parents, and she puts on the record by the group she hired for the concert. Fonzie is baffled when classical music starts playing.
My little angel eyes, I think you got totally confused there. I want to hear the music we're going to hear at the concert first, then you can play this stuff.
Oh, if this is the group, Fonz.
It's the Boston Conservatory Orchestra. Fonzie shakes in horror. The kids are expecting rock and roll, not this. He's even more horrified to hear the music is by Tchaikovsky. It's not even American. He's listened to classical before, when he was stuck in an elevator, and now he has to tell the students they'll be listening to dead people playing music. Cynthia calls him closed-minded. Tchaikovsky sacrificed his very sanity to compose this music. She leaves to cool off so they can discuss it more intelligently later. Alone and bored, Fonzie reads about Tchaikovsky off of the record jacket, and finds himself starting to relate to the composer.
He was the most renowned composer of his era, and women found him irresistible.
In fact, Fonzie drifts off and dreams that he is Tchaikovsky, struggling to compose a new concerto for the Tsarina.
Nothing will come. I don't know what it is, Ivan. I just can't play anything well anymore.
And impressing his beautiful lady friend with his music. By the time he is woken up by Howard and Marion, Fonzie has completely changed his tune on the composer. He goes to make up with Cynthia, and convince the student body of Jefferson High that they will love classical music.
I gotta convince the entire student body of Jefferson High that they will love classical music.
Oh, you can do it, Clarence. Don't worry.
Do it! Howard is going in the dumper.
The next day at Arnold's, Joni and Chachi's band perform Twist and Shout, and Fonzie makes his announcement about the group for the upcoming concert. At a snap of his fingers, Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy plays on the jukebox. The assembled teens think this must all be a big joke, but Fonzie is dead serious, and he refuses to let them take a vote on it until next week, during which Arnold's will only play classical. A week later at Arnold's, Jenny, Joni, and Chachi are glumly listening to Moonlight Sonata.
If I have to listen to this music for one more week, I will lose my cookies.
They're joined by a very cheerful Bobby, and a less cheerful Melvin, escorted by Fonzie and Cynthia. The vote is held, and only one person votes for classical, and it's Melvin. The students leave, and Cynthia reassures Fonzie. He was just trying to introduce them to something new. Fonzie would rather not talk about it, but will still be going to the piano recital later with Cynthia. After she leaves, he turns on the jukebox, and conducts along to The Blue Danube. Cynthia saw the whole thing. After the piano recital concludes, Fonzie sees a pair of familiar faces, Joni and Chachi. They try to make excuses.
Well, we were just walking by this place and decided to duck in out of the rain.
It's not raining.
But eventually admit that classical music has grown on them. The next day at the Cunningham house, Howard and Marion are exercising to their record again.
Yeah, we should do this every day because as the coach Danny says, fit people are fun people.
After seeing what they have to do tomorrow, they break the record.
Thank you, Peter. That was A Touch of Classical. It first aired back on February 2nd, 1982. On that night, Happy Days was followed by a new Laverne and Shirley in which the girls planned to get revenge on a rude singer by taking incriminating pictures of him and selling them to a tabloid. This episode featured guest appearances by Harry Dean Stanton and Harry Shearer. CBS went with a couple of animated specials. At 8 o'clock, it was Bugs Bunny's Valentine, in which Bugs falls in love with the electric rabbit at a dog track.
CBS is sending you a very special Valentine. What's up, Doc?
That crazy rabbit's back in the Looney Tunes Heart Thumper, Bugs Bunny's Valentine.
This was followed by Popeye's Valentine special, in which an annoyed Olive Oyl signs up for a romantic cruise in order to meet Mr. Right.
I'm going to find my Mr. Right on the Valentine's Day Sweetheart Cruise.
And NBC had a new episode of Father Murphy. This week, a runaway boy from the South joins Murphy's school, but clashes with Moses, a black prospector who helps Murphy run the school. Eventually, the boy teams up with the KKK to try to drive Moses out of town. So, Peter, of those choices, what are you watching?
Well, I'm not watching the KKK one. Oh my God. I would probably watch Looney Tunes and Popeye have Valentine's Day specials, especially because neither of them involve the KKK, I assume.
I would assume neither one does. I am definitely watching Bugs Bunny's Valentine, Popeye's Valentine special. This was a no-brainer. Touch of Classical was directed by Jerry Paris, and it was written by Rich Carell and our pal, Fred Fox Jr. Fred, we already know well. The last of his episodes that we covered was Little Baby Cunningham, but this was Rich's first Happy Day script. He'll write 4 more. Rich started out as a child actor in the 1950s and 60s, best known for his recurring role as Richard Rickover on Leave It to Beaver. He even came back for the reunion movie, Still the Beaver, in 1983. He was also on Hazel, Lassie, Dobie Gillis, Ozzie and Harriet, and more. He grew up to be a prolific writer, producer, and director of television shows. As a director, his credits include That's So Raven, The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Yes Dear, The Amanda Show, Hannah Montana, Perfect Strangers, Married with Children, 89 episodes of Family Matters, and 50 more of Step by Step. In recent years, he's reunited with Raven Simone on the show Raven's House. As for guest stars this week, obviously the main one is Marla Pennington as Cynthia Brannigan. This is the first of her 2 appearances on Happy Days. She'll be back next week. Marla is an actress from Los Angeles who is best known as Joan Lawson, the mother on the infamous sitcom Small Wonder.
Your company makes electronic gadgets, those robots that weld cars and fill bottles and stick labels on cans.
That's right.
Well, then why would he be interested in a doll?
Joni, honey, this is not just a doll. It's an experimental VICI.
Give that to me in English.
But she had a number of TV acting credits in the 70s and 80s, including Soap, General Hospital, The Incredible Hulk, Magnum P.I., and Different Strokes, plus the movie National Lampoon's Class Reunion. Her experience on Small Wonder, sometimes called the worst sitcom of all time, convinced her to give up acting and become a full-time mom. She's not bitter about Small Wonder, but it just taught her that acting was not for her. So, Peter, before I even ask you about Marla Pennington, what is your history, if any, with Small Wonder? Have you ever watched the show? Were you familiar with it at all?
I have heard of it. I know that it's infamous. I didn't know that it's been called the worst sitcom of all time. But given that the premise is extremely dodgy, that doesn't really surprise me.
I rewatched the pilot for Small Wonder last night, and the show is incredibly creepy. For people who don't know, it's about your average typical sitcom suburban family, except that the daughter is a robot that was built by the dad. In the first episode, we see the disassembled body of the daughter in a box that the dad brought home from work. Just generally, the jokes on Small Wonder are extremely lame, and the laugh track is very enthusiastic about them. So it makes for a weird viewing experience. Marla is fine as the mom, but it's a very creepy and weird show that I kind of recommend to people. But Peter, what did you think of Marla Pennington as Cynthia Brannigan?
I liked her a lot. She came across as a very intelligent, level-headed woman, and I think that's best exemplified in the scene where she and Fonzie are having an argument over the fact that Fonzie thinks that classical music is boring. And she just says, okay, we're clearly not going to get anywhere with this. I'm just going to go and cool off, and then when we're both calmer about this, we can discuss it. And it kind of ends up working, although she probably didn't predict that it would work because Fonzie had a out-of-body experience in which he was Tchaikovsky, and she was his pretty lady friend. I did not mention this during the summary, but in Fonzie's Tchaikovsky dream, she plays his love interest.
I think Marla gives an excellent performance in this episode. She really commits to the role of this music teacher who loves classical music and is so serious about it. The other thing I like about this performance is that this is a dynamic they have tried with Fonzie before, pairing him with a classy, intelligent, educated woman who doesn't put up with his usual nonsense. We had that a little bit earlier this season in the Home Movies two-parter where he was dating the teacher, and nothing developed out of that. This relationship will go for 2 episodes, and eventually they will devote an entire season of Happy Days to a relationship similar to this, where Fonzie is getting away from the type of woman he normally dates and starts dating a woman with a little bit more substance. We also have David Wheatley as the pianist at the recital. David is a real-life composer and musician from Ontario, Canada, now based in Los Angeles. He contributed music to a number of films, including The Golden Child, The Beach Girls, China O'Brien, and Speed Zone. He's also written 3 original stage musicals and continues to tour and perform as a classical and jazz musician. I would not say that he does any acting here. What did you think of David Wheatley as our pianist?
He played the piano very well. It's really cool that he's that prolific.
I think David plays the piano adequately here. As for songs, this is a very music-heavy episode. This episode starts with Surfin' USA by the Beach Boys.
Everybody had an ocean across the USA.
This was a top 10 hit for them in 1963. At Arnold's, we hear an instrumental version of On Broadway by the Drifters. It was also a top 10 hit in 1963. Peter, that song has always puzzled me for one reason.
Why's that?
So the guy in the song is trying to make it on Broadway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's telling him he's not going to make it. And he says, but they're wrong. I know they are, because I can play this here guitar and I won't quit till I'm a star on Broadway. What kind of guitar playing job is he hoping to get on Broadway? Playing in the pit of a show or something? That's not going to make you a star. Broadway doesn't really have that much market for guitar players. Maybe he's on the wrong street.
Pretty much every city has a Broadway. New York just has the most famous one, so maybe he's not in New York. Wait, The Sound of Music. Maria Von Trapp plays a guitar in a couple of scenes in that.
So maybe he plays acoustic guitar, hopefully. The music that Cynthia first plays for Fonzie and the Cunninghams is Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto in B-flat minor. He wrote it between 1874 and 1875, then revised it in 1879 and 1888. It's not only one of Tchaikovsky's best-known and loved compositions, but one of the most famous concerti in history. My association with the Piano Concerto in B-flat minor is a Monty Python sketch where an escape artist plays this on the piano while escaping from a big burlap bag. He's just banging on the keys from inside that bag. Fonzie as Tchaikovsky performs a bit of the 1812 overture, complete with a miniature cannon. Tchaikovsky wrote that piece in 1880 to commemorate the time Russia successfully defended itself against Napoleon's invading army in 1812. And yes, it is customarily performed with actual cannons going off, making it a piece that is generally performed outdoors.
Whenever someone claims classical music is boring, the 1812 overture is usually what people point to disprove that. Yeah, that makes sense. Even without the cannons, it's like a very exciting, bombastic piece, and it's great for a reason.
Fonzie also performs the Waltz of the Flowers. Tchaikovsky composed this in 1892. It appears during the second act of The Nutcracker. So last month, you probably heard the Waltz of the Flowers somewhere because of the Christmas season. The song he plays for Cynthia is from an orchestral work called Romeo and Juliet, inspired by the Shakespeare play. This was another piece that went through numerous revisions. The first version from 1870 was not well received. He revised it in 1872 and then again in 1880. It's that third version that became extremely famous and popular. Joni and Chachi then performed Twist and Shout.
Well, shake it up, baby, now. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout.
This song has a convoluted history. It was originally recorded by a group called the Top Notes in 1961, produced by Phil Spector himself.
Shake it up, baby.
But it was the Isley Brothers who had a hit with it in 1962. The next year, the Beatles released their hit version. It's been covered in many styles by many acts since then. In 1986, just 4 years after this episode, it was a hit all over again when the Beatles version was included in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Peter, what did you think of Joni and Chachi's version of Twist and Shout?
It's all right. It's not as good as the Beatles version or the Isley Brothers version, but it's serviceable. It's got energy.
Joni and Chachi do not ruin the song with their version. Twist and Shout is a song that's difficult to ruin. It kind of helps you along as it goes. One thing I noticed is that the Beatles version has a very famous part where they sing in harmony. Joni and Chachi do that in their version too, but there's only 2 of them, so they run out of people after the first 2 notes, the and then the and then 2 other people that we never see get to do the
Who are they?
Who are they? Well, obviously there's an army of session musicians working on this thing that we never see. The recording that Fonzie plays for the kids at Arnold's is Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy. Like Waltz of the Flowers, it comes from Act 2 of Tchaikovsky's 1892 ballet, The Nutcracker. It serves as the accompaniment to a dance by a solo ballerina. Tchaikovsky wrote this piece to take advantage of a then new instrument called the celesta, which is sort of like a toy piano. The kids at Arnold may not dig Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, but Beavis and Butthead liked it, with Beavis saying it sounds like Ozzy Osbourne.
This song's pretty cool. Yeah. It sounds like Ozzy.
The slow, mournful piano music we hear a little later at Arnold's is Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, widely known as the Moonlight Sonata. Beethoven wrote it in 1801 and debuted it in 1802. It's one of Beethoven's most popular compositions and was even a hit in its own day. If you hear it in a movie, that means something really bad is about to go down or has just gone down. The prime example is in the movie Misery with James Caan and Kathy Bates. We hear the Moonlight Sonata right before Kathy Bates breaks both of James Caan's legs with a hammer. So,
You've been out of your room.
No, I haven't.
Paul.
When Fonzie kicks the jukebox, he plays the Blue Danube by Austrian composer Johann Strauss. This piece was written in 1866 and first performed in 1867. Its full title is By the Beautiful Blue Danube. And at the piano recital, we hear a reprise of Waltz of the Flowers. That's what they brought in the special piano player to do. As for cultural and historical references, this episode revolves around so-called classical music. The term classical has been used to describe a wide variety of art music outside the confines of pop and folk, including symphonic music, opera, ballet, and compositions for solo instruments and small ensembles. Strict musicologists say the true classical era of music existed only from 1730 to 1820, less than 100 years, meaning that Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky would not be a classical composer, but rather a romantic composer. We've already talked about the tradition of bringing apples to teachers.
An apple for the teacher.
Oh, thank you.
It goes back to 16th century Denmark and Sweden. Back then, teachers made such poor wages that their students would bring them food. The concert at Jefferson High has a budget of $1,000. Adjusting for inflation, that's nearly $10,000. An absurdly high budget for such an event. Did they ever put on at your school a $10,000 concert for
No,
you?
they did not. I think Jefferson High might be doing some money laundering or something.
Howard and Marion's subplot involves them working out to a fitness record. In real life, exercise instruction records became trendy in the 1960s, but I found examples going back as far as the 1940s. Coach Danny from this episode is fictional, but there are exercise albums by Jack LaLanne, Jane Fonda, Bonnie Pruden, and Johnny Pearson, among many more. Such albums were still being made well into the 1980s. Peter, were you familiar with these fitness records or exercise albums?
I was not, but I guess it makes perfect sense for those to exist as kind of like a precursor to exercise videos.
Cynthia mentions the Boston Conservatory Orchestra. The Boston Conservatory is a private performing arts college founded in 1867. Naturally, they have their own orchestra, but it does not seem to be a touring ensemble. If you want to hear them, you go to Boston. They don't play at high schools in Wisconsin.
What would the Boston Conservatory Orchestra be doing in Milwaukee?
I don't know.
Like I said, this all feels like some sort of money laundering is going on. And hey, at least the kids are going to enjoy some classical music, so maybe money laundering isn't all that bad.
Fonzie says that the kids at Jefferson High have been waiting for Chuck Berry, even though in the Happy Days universe, he had just played a concert in Milwaukee a few weeks earlier. In reality, Chuck had been mired in legal problems in the early 60s and was in prison from 1962 to 1963. Around the time of this story, Chuck was just restarting his career, largely in England, where he was still revered. Cynthia says that Tchaikovsky sacrificed his personal life, his health, and even his own sanity for his music. Okay, that is a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky was a Russian composer who lived from 1840 until his death at age 53 in 1893. Although he did not come from great wealth, he did not come from great poverty either. He achieved considerable success and fame while he was still alive, becoming the first Russian composer whose music truly broke through in the West. In fact, he toured Europe and America as a celebrity conductor. Two of his most famous works, the ballets Swan Lake and The Nutcracker, were written during those touring years. He was a perfectionist, as this episode depicts.
I will strive for perfection.
But he was supposedly introverted and uncomfortable around people. If there was trauma in his life, it came from the fact that he could not live openly as a gay man in 19th century Russia. This was what destroyed his marriage. His death came from drinking unboiled water during a cholera epidemic. Was this suicide or just an accident? We don't know. Though a popular legend has sprung up that Tchaikovsky was a tortured man whose music reflects his deep sadness. This ignores the fact that many of his most famous compositions, including the ones that we hear in this episode, are not sad in the least. If you hear the 1812 overture, that does not sound like the work of somebody who's sad and tortured.
Yeah, you don't listen to the Nutcracker and think, man, this guy had issues. You think, oh, hey, Christmas.
A lot of the legend of Tchaikovsky has been exaggerated. Studying the album cover, Fonzie says, look at the way he dresses. But Tchaikovsky was a very bland-looking guy who just wore regular-looking dark suits and ties. If you're imagining him with a powdered wig or a frilly collar or something, think again. Tchaikovsky looks like what he was, a music professor. His album covers are very dull. In the flashback, Tchaikovsky says he has to compose a concerto for the Tsarina. In real life, he did have a patroness for part of his career, but she was not a Tsarina. I cannot find any record of him writing for royalty.
The Tchaikovsky dream makes a lot more sense when you remember that Fonzie has literally just learned who Tchaikovsky is. The record jacket probably isn't that accurate, and this is entirely Fonzie's interpretation of what Tchaikovsky was like, and it has very little basis in reality.
He's read like a couple of paragraphs about Tchaikovsky's life and has extrapolated from there. He does get one detail right, though. In the flashback, Tchaikovsky asks a bust of Mozart for guidance. I don't know if Tchaikovsky actually owned such a statue in real life, but he definitely worshipped Mozart, saying that his music seemed to be the very voice of God. He even referred to Mozart as the musical Christ. Roger says that classical music aids in the digestive process. Is this true? Yes, it is. Humans digest their food more easily when they feel calm, safe, and relaxed. Classical, easy listening, and soft jazz can all help with this process.
Probably not the 1812 overture, though.
It depends on what you've just eaten, I suppose.
Somebody do this for science, please, and tell us how it happens.
Fonzie says, this music beats Bebop-A-Lula. Bebop-A-Lula is a classic rockabilly song by Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps that was a top 10 hit in 1956. Other observations this week. Potsy is in this episode, but he does not actually speak. I wondered what was going on there. It's actually kind of odd. He just stands there nodding and saying nothing. What was happening there, Peter?
I guess they couldn't think of anything for Potsy to do, but they wanted to have Anson Williams there.
Which is nice. They could have at least had him say, uh-huh, or yeah. Howard's chair is back this week, and Fonzie even gets to jump into it. Eventually, I think there has to be a scene where Fonzie goes to jump in the chair, and then it's not there. Fonzie scoffs at the idea of wearing white socks. But since he wears boots, what does it matter what color his socks are?
It matters to Fonzie because he knows, even if nobody else does.
But are black socks somehow cooler than white socks? I wear black socks to work.
Then you're very cool by Fonzie's standards.
Look at those hairless shins. Decades of black dress socks have rendered them smooth and mirror-like.
One thing that this episode overlooks is that numerous pop and rock songs draw on classical and romantic music for inspiration, including the music of Tchaikovsky. In 1962, Bee Bumble and the Stingers had a hit with Nut Rocker, a rock version of the March from the Nutcracker.
Did they have to call it Nut Rocker? There has to have been a better title for it than that.
I realize that title sounds incredibly filthy, but that was the title. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which we also hear in this episode, was turned into Past, Present, and Future by the Shangri-Las in 1966.
Past. Well, now, let me tell you about the past.
Peter, have you heard Past, Present, and Future by the Shangri-Las?
I have. Good song.
Yeah, that is an excellent recording. I thought for sure that the finale of this episode was going to be that there would be an ensemble that could play classical music in a rock style and then please both sides, but nothing close to that happens. And hey, here's an idea. Hire Joni and Chachi's band for the concert and spend $1,000 on something else. I think you could get Joni and Chachi's band for what, $10? That would leave you $990 to spend on other things like maybe school supplies and...
Joe, as we have established, this is a money laundering operation.
And I was genuinely surprised when Fonzie opened the stained glass window behind the bandstand. I didn't know it even opened. Did you notice that moment when he opens the stained glass window behind the bandstand?
Yes.
I didn't know it did that. So we're learning new things about the new Arnolds. And the sound that Melvin Belvin makes is one of the worst things I have ever heard in my life. Are you familiar with the noise that I'm referring to?
Yep.
Whose idea was it to add Melvin Belvin to the show? That was an awful sound. But I did like that Jenny Piccolo physically attacks him for making that sound. That was a satisfying moment for me. And when Marion lists the exercises at the end of the show, I thought she was saying 100 truck twists, but she's saying 100 trunk twists.
100 leg lifts, 100 truck twists, 100 toe touches.
To do this, you stand up, hold your arms out at your sides like airplane wings, and pivot your upper body to one side, then the the other. You're twisting the trunk of your body. So
That's what that's called? Huh.
Yes, trunk twists. It's apparently a military thing. It was a Marine exercise. So, Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions in A Touch of Classical?
I really liked the dress that Cynthia wore in Fonzie's Tchaikovsky Dream. It's this very pretty pseudo-19th century red dress. It's kind of frilly. I have no idea if it's historically accurate or not. I'm willing to bet it's probably not, but it's very, very pretty.
What does Fonzie actually wear? Does he wear his leather jacket?
He does not. I'm sure it was very hard for him to have a dream in which he was not wearing his jacket.
They had to pry it off of him for one scene. So, Peter, I will ask that age-old, timeless question. Was this episode any good?
Yeah, it was. This is once again another episode in which Fonzie is a melodramatic baby who gets way too invested into things that maybe don't matter as much as he thinks they do. But it is very fun for that reason, and I thought his dynamic with Cynthia was very enjoyable, and I'm glad that she's going to show up for at least one more episode.
I really enjoyed A Touch of Classical, partly because I listen to a lot of classical, and I've been playing classical music for most of my life. I don't just listen to classical. I listen to as much music in as many genres as I can, but classical is part of my music diet, so to speak. When I got into this episode, and I realized it was going to be a classical versus rock episode, I had no idea I was about to get a flashback with Fonzie as Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. So that was a gift from heaven. I like the dynamic between Cynthia and Fonzie. I like their relationship a lot. If I have one complaint about this episode, it's that the story sort of fizzles out. Fonzie takes the L on this classical versus rock thing, and then the story doesn't have any place to go from there. I guess we're supposed to take solace in the fact that Joni and Chachi went to the piano recital and enjoyed it, but it feels like the story kind of leads to nothing.
I think it's a sign of Fonzie's character development that he's reached the point where he can allow his students to disagree with him and not just keep trying to push them into liking classical music. The thing with being someone who works with kids is that you shouldn't try and force them to do or think anything because they'll just end up resenting you. You can guide them, but you can't force them. I think that's what I like about the Joni and Chachi resolution, where they have been kind of influenced into liking classical music once they don't have to be around their peers and pretend to hate it in order to save face.
I guess it's more realistic in this episode that the victory that Fonzie gets at the end is a little victory and not a big victory. It just felt a little anticlimactic to me. I'm spoiled by 200 episodes of Happy Days because normally Fonzie gets a big victory at the end of every show. So, Peter, this is our 200th episode, and I will ask another age-old timeless question. What have you learned from doing 200 episodes of a Happy Days podcast?
I've learned that podcasting is both simpler and more complicated than I expected it to be. When you hyperfixate on something to the point where you decide that you want to talk about it every week for however many years we've been doing this, you can move mountains. I've learned that art can bring people together, even if it's a cheesy sitcom from the 70s and 80s. And I've learned that when you work together with someone every week for however many years you've been doing this, you can build the foundation of a lasting friendship.
Those are lovely thoughts, Peter, and I agree with all of them. Doing 200 episodes of a Happy Days podcast is a lot of work, but it's also a very emotionally fulfilling experience, mainly because I like collaborating with you on this project that has gone on for 4 years and change. If there's one thing I've learned about Happy Days from doing this, I've learned to appreciate the power of actors. I would say Happy Days is much more of an actor's showcase than it is a writer's showcase.
I feel like every other episode we talk about how much we like Marion Ross as an actor, and she really is terrific.
I've realized why Marion is my favorite character, and it's because Marion Ross is giving my favorite performance on the show. When you work on a show like Happy Days, especially when it's filmed in front of a live studio audience, the responsibility of the actor is to go out there and sell these jokes and sell these stories to the audience. And let's be honest here, Happy Days does not have the strongest jokes or the most original stories. If you wanted to work on a really brilliantly written sitcom in the 1970s, go work on All in the Family or MASH or Mary Tyler Moore or Taxi or Soap or a bunch of other shows before you get to Happy Days. Happy Days, again, is more of a showcase for its actors and its characters. And I don't think there's anybody in the cast who's better at selling these jokes to the audience than Marion Ross. And she can sell the pathos, and she can sell the drama, and sell the warmth and the humor of the show. And the other actors are all very good. I mean, Henry Winkler is working his ass off every week to sell this material. Tom Bosley, again, also great at selling this stuff. It's really made me appreciate the importance of casting on a show and the importance of the actors. And I would say that actors, even if they're not literally writing the show, are influencing the writing of a show.
Like, I think that's definitely a big case in how Fonzie developed, because Henry Winkler in real life, he's this very sweet, cuddly guy, and I think that kind of comes through when it comes to Fonzie, where over time he went from this scary hood type into this melodramatic teddy bear man.
A melodramatic teddy bear man is a very good a description of Fonzie. And by the way, we reviewed the 200th episode of Happy Days a few weeks ago. They actually have more episodes than we do because we've reviewed two-parters at once. So the 200th episode was the one about Eugene Belvin and the Barufi sting. Hello, tough guy. So, Peter, how can people keep up with us and find out about all the wonderful things that we are doing?
Listeners can follow us on Twitter at Fonzie Podcast. They can follow me on Twitter at Peter Bullfrunk. That's PeterVulFranc.
And they can follow me on Twitter at Joe_A_Blevins. They can find this podcast online at thesedaysofours.libsyn.com. And they can email us with questions, comments, and concerns at thesedaysofourspodcast@gmail.com. So, Peter, what do we have on the docket for next week?
Next week, Fonzie gets to meet the Lone Ranger. Well, the actor who played him. In Hi-Yo Fonzie Away.
That sounds like a milestone in the series' history. So, see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
Beethoven's gone, but his music lives on, and Mozart don't go shopping no more. You'll never meet Liszt or Brahms again, and Elgar doesn't answer the door. They're decomposing composers, there's nothing much anyone can do. You can still hear Beethoven, but Beethoven cannot hear you.
Melodramatic Teddy Bear Man.